All right, webinar is starting.
Alex, do you want me to introduce you as Alex or Alexander?
Either or is fine.
Okay. Welcome. I am Dr. Laura Westhoff. I'm chair of the history department, and I'm here on behalf of both the faculty of the history department and the Department of Political Science to welcome you to our presentation today that will provide some backdrop to the Ukrainian crisis. Our title is The Ukrainian Crisis and the Future of War. My colleagues and I were discussing just before we went live that, in fact, we'll probably be outdated with our information by the time we finish today, as the news from Eastern Europe is moving rapidly. Nonetheless, we want to provide some information, background to the events that have unfolded over the past week in the Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe. I'm also a student in both the political science department with a minor in history. Alexander Frost will be our moderator today. And I will turn my camera off, turn things over to Alex to introduce the panelists and to get things started. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you everyone for tuning in today. As Dr. Westhoff was explaining, today's webinar will be going into the Ukraine crisis, some of the events that have unfolded over the past few days, some of the historical context as well that precipitated this current crisis. Today, our speakers that are joining us are Dr. Axie, Dr. Fernlund, and Dr. Bagwell. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Axie, who I believe is going to give some of the historical motivations and some of the history behind this Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, thanks, History Department and Political Science Department for inviting me to this. And I'm going to sort of grab a couple notes I have here. I want to go through this somewhat systematically because there's a couple of important points I'd like to make about the current crisis. And an opening sort of statement is that what is happening now in the last week is really the culmination of almost 20 years effort by Putin to replace an independent and strong Ukraine with one that is committed to anti-NATO and anti-EU membership. This is something Putin announced many years ago. The three enemies to Russia are the EU, NATO, and the United States. So this is part of a larger effort and is not just something done on the will of the moment sort of thing. And it may or may not mean or aim at the reincorporation of the Ukraine into Russia. But Putin has made statements like that recently, and we'll let the other panelists deal with those sorts of issues. Another important point is twice in the last 10 years or so, civil disobedience and protest movements have frustrated Putin's efforts at putting in a complacent, compliant political regime in Kiev. And now the gloves are off and no more sort of small scale efforts at getting a compliant Ukraine. The effort now is to force it into a sort of compliance and again, anti-EU, anti-NATO. So there's a long entangled history between the Ukraine and Russia, or should I say the Ukrainian people and Russia. For our purposes, it's important to note that the Ukraine has not existed as an independent nation until about 1990 or 1991, excepting a very short period associated with the First World War and the Russian Civil War that did not last very long. The Ukraine took its current shape during the Russian Empire, the World War I, and the Russian Civil War. The Ukraine is made up of an east, west, and a south that are all quite different. The western portion of the Ukraine was part of the Habsburg Empire and is the most nationalistic, and the people are often referred to as Ruthenians or Ruthenia. The eastern portion of the Ukraine experienced an influx of Russian speakers associated with the development of industrialization in Russia. The Donbass, or Don River Basin, or the Don River Coal Basin, was an early industrialized area of the Soviet Union, and it has much of a feel of Pittsburgh about it. It's a heyday has long passed as far as an industrial area. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union in the 50s and middle 60s, provided a detailed description of the area in his memoirs. He was a metal worker in what was then called Yuzovka, which is now Donetsk. Much of Khrushchev's career was spent in the Ukraine, and this will have a impact on later developments and today, choices that Khrushchev made as premier. In 1929, a Ukrainian nationalist movement was founded in Vienna. Its initials are the OUN, and it mainly operated against Poland and was involved at that time with terrorism and assassination in Poland. It was unable to operate effectively in the Soviet Union. This will become important later as well. The early 1930s brought a famine to the Ukraine, not from weather conditions, but a man-made famine, as the Ukrainians resisted the forced collectivization of agriculture, as ordered by Stalin, and Stalin then replied with violence and repression. Millions died in this great famine, or the terror famine. The Ukrainians call this the Holodomor, and it is a central to the Ukrainian modern national consciousness, the sufferings that they were subject to during the Soviet time in the early 1930s. There is a debate on the purpose and scope of this famine, but there's no question about the many who died. It wasn't just only Ukrainians who died, but it appeared that the Ukraine was unequally damaged by this famine in the early 1930s. During World War II, the nationalist organization, that OUN, split into two factions. Both tried to collaborate and declare independence, but the Germans were not interested in that. The faction led by Stepan Bandera, you might want to remember his name, created an armed militia known as a UPA, and they engaged in mass killings of rival Ukrainians and perhaps 100,000 Poles who lived in an area that the Ukrainian nationalists wanted for a post-war Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalists, a small number, also were participants in various parts of the Holocaust. And as probably is known, the Baba Yar genocide took place inside or just outside of Kiev. So a central experience, again, of Ukraine was the Holocaust as well. The Ukraine was liberated by the Red Army, but Ukrainian nationalists continued to fight and led by Bandera in exile. Bandera collaborated both with British intelligence and American intelligence during the Cold War. And this, of course, has shaped Putin's thinking about the US relation to ultranationalism or fascism, is what Bandera is understood at by the Russians. Bandera himself was assassinated in 1959 in Munich by the KGB. At about the same time, Crimea was transferred to the Ukrainian SSR for administrative purposes by Khrushchev. He never meant this to be any sort of punishment to Russia. To him was just a very simple sort of a transference. After August 1991 coup attempt against Gorbachev, Ukraine declares independence. It gets a 90% pro-independence vote. And that while Boris Yeltsin was in office as Russian leader, relationships went pretty well and the status quo was developed. A series of presidents were elected, Kravchuk, Kuchma, in two separate people. In 2004, this is sort of bringing us up to date, a fellow named Viktor Yanukovych won the presidential election, and he was understood as pro-Russian, anti-EU membership, anti-NATO. But there was widespread vote fraud suspected. A fellow named Viktor Yushchenko protested this. He was the other candidate. And many of the older people here will remember that he was poisoned by a dioxin derivative. And the picture of his face, he almost died from this. And most people assumed that this was directly from Russia, this material and this sort of way of poisoning opponents. So an orange revolution in 2004 overthrew Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president, and put Yushchenko in power. The West funded and encouraged the Orange Revolution, seeing it as real democracy and hoping for a more westward orientation. In 2010, right as Yushchenko was to leave office, he lost to Yanukovych. Yushchenko awarded Bandera the title of Hero of the Ukraine. And as you might expect, this was an explosive development to Russians, Jewish people, Poles, to turn what many people see as a war criminal and murderer into the hero of the Ukraine. Yanukovych was not himself an ultranationalist, but he certainly helped feed the ultranationalists. Yanukovych came in again as president, but by 2013, the Euromaidan protests, the protesters wanted EU membership. Yanukovych wanted no EU, no NATO, tilting it towards pro-Russian position. Yanukovych is forced out because of this Euromaidan protest, and then fled to eastern Ukraine and then to Russia. So you can see some of the points of contention and some of the rhetoric that Putin can use against the Ukraine about being a Nazi state or a fascist state or ultranationalist, making a hero of Bandera, OUN, sort of a thing. Then, as soon as the Euromaidan protest had ended, Putin began his series of moves against Crimea and in the eastern Ukraine. And just as a note, as I kind of finish here, some of you again will remember July 2014, a Malaysian airliner flying from Amsterdam to Singapore was shot down by these Russian rebels in Donetsk or Luhansk mistakenly, but with weaponry supplied by Russia and by Putin. So wouldn't argue that Putin ordered this sort of thing, but certainly made it possible by supplying these sophisticated weapons to the rebels in eastern Ukraine. So just a little background about how there is a scintilla of support to where Putin's denunciations of Ukraine comes from. In my view, completely overstated and disconnected from the truth, but useful propaganda for his suppression of Nazis next door, sort of thing. So I think my 5 minutes are up, so I will conclude there.
Thank you, Dr. Axie. Quite a bit to unpack as far as the historical context of this current invasion. Dr. Fernland.
Yes, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start by pointing to my virtual background. This is a painting by Pablo Picasso called Guernica, and it's considered by some scholars to be the most powerful anti-war painting that was ever made. So that hopefully will show you sort of where I'm where I'm coming from in all of this, in this David and Goliath contest that we're seeing take place overseas. The other thing I would just quickly want to add is I'm going to date myself here. I was educated many decades ago when it was common to refer to Ukraine as the Ukraine, which is a reference to a region, versus Ukraine as a nation. In fact, I understand good patriotic Ukrainians take offense at the definite article being used before Ukraine, the Ukraine. They want it to be just Ukraine. But if I do say the Ukraine, I mean no offense. It's just old habits of mine that are sometimes very hard to break. By the same token, I understand that Kiev, which is how I always have pronounced the capital of Ukraine, is pronounced Kiev in Ukrainian, and it's the Russians who say Kiev. But so I will try to say Kiev, but again, if I lapse and say Kiev, again, I mean no offense. My sympathies are very much with the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian nation in all of this. Okay, I'd like to get started, first of all, with the date, February 24th, 2022. That's when all of this started. That'll be a date future professors will want their teachers to remember, because that is certainly a day in infamy. In fact, it was on that day that Joe Biden said, and I quote, "Russia has committed a flagrant violation of international law." And I would just like to pause and take that in. What does that mean? Well, here's another date. In August 27th, 1928, the world, beginning with the United States and France, signed what was known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which proscribed or outlawed war, specifically wars of conquest. That's in 1928. Now, of course, what follows in the next few years is the invasion of Manchuria by Japan, later Hitler's invasion of Poland, and so forth. And so the Kellogg-Briand Pact has been often dismissed by historians, scholars as naive, ineffective, because, well, look what happened, World War II. Fair enough, but here's what I would want for you to all to bear in mind. When World War II came to an end, all of the wars of conquest that Japan, Italy, and Germany had waged, and all of the territories they had conquered, all of that was rolled back, all of it. And the idea that wars of conquest were now illegal had taken firm hold, and they formed the foundation of the Atlantic Charter that was worked out by Britain and the United States in 1941, and underlie the Charter of the United Nations in 1945. So this idea that wars of conquest are illegal takes hold. And the victorious powers in World War II, France, the United States, Great Britain, none of them acquired new territories. after World War II. None of them did that. So the idea of conquering new countries, new lands, peoples, that idea was now passe. 1928 is a real divide. There's one big exception to that, and that is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union after World War II refused to withdraw from Eastern Europe. In fact, kept its forces in Eastern Europe. And the fact that they insisted that they had the right to create a near abroad or a sphere of influence and so forth in Eastern Europe would be a bone of contention, and it would be the source of the ensuing Cold War, which would then go from 1945 until 1991. Now, the folks in Eastern Europe weren't happy that they were occupied by Russia. In fact, Russia had to send their troops into Germany in 1949, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968 to stifle and oppress and put down the peoples of Eastern Europe. So Russia actually has a long history of doing just exactly what we're seeing Russia do right now. Well, again, I'm going through history at 30,000 feet here, so I'm moving real quick. So the Cold War does come to an end, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so that allows Germany to be united. And the Soviet Union withdraws from Eastern Europe, and we see the liberation of Eastern Europe, or the unification of Europe, depending on your perspective. So that was a major development. As we know, Putin regarded that as the worst catastrophe to befall the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberation of Eastern Europe. So that's where he's coming from. Interesting enough, NATO, which was an organization formed in 1949 to defend Europe against the Soviet Union, which was in Eastern Europe, is not disbanded after the end of the Cold War. In fact, it expands and enjoys a new vitality because all of the Eastern European countries that had been oppressed by the Soviet Union all want to join NATO and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So they all join. And by the way, the NATO is a defensive organization. It's not an offensive organization. It's there to defend Europe, and membership is voluntary. So Poland wants to be a part of NATO. It doesn't have to be a part of NATO. So I think that's something that's real important. The other thing that you should know about NATO is that it has what's called Article 5. And that's what I call the Three Musketeers clause. It's all for one, one for all. So in other words, if any NATO nation is attacked, they consider that attack on all of NATO. So that's a pretty remarkable thing. So Article 5 is a key. It was invoked one time, and that was after 9/11, interestingly enough. So that's NATO. Eastern Europe is now liberated, but what we know is during the 90s, 2000s, and to the present, Russia has continued to be active politically in what was this former Soviet space, trying to push in every where it can, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. In fact, Russia will invade Ukraine in 2014. So 100 years after the beginning of World War I, we see a European country invade another country. And so Russia has been at war with Ukraine since 2014, but just focused in the Donbass region. What it's doing now, of course, is it's expanded and it's moved the war to other parts of Ukraine. And that happened, I think, very significantly after Putin very recently went to China. China and Russia both basically have declared sort of a new friendship alliance that will suggest that the world island, Eurasia, is now under two great autocracies stretching from Russia all the way to the Pacific. So once China basically gave Russia a blank check, Russia took that and then invaded Russia, which again is a flagrant violation of international law. So that that's what I have in a nutshell. And I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Fernland. It's certainly interesting looking at the timeline of the Olympics, Putin's meeting with President Xi, quite a lot to unpack here. Thank you. Dr. Bagwell.
Thank you, Dr. Axie and Dr. Fernland, for the enlightening historical context. I hope that you keep that in mind as I'm talking about some of the bigger picture motivations for why Putin decided to invade and why right now. That's really what I'm going to be trying to address. And so I'm going to apply this analytical framework that we use in political science, looking at motivation and willingness or willingness and opportunity, and trying to explain it through that lens. I think we've heard a couple of potential explanations, and I'll throw a couple others out there as well. Senator from Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, says this is about acquiring more farmland for Russia because they're a communist country. Neither of which of those things is accurate. I don't think about NATO expansion. I do believe that Putin views NATO as a threat, but there hasn't been a lot of, I'm sorry, can you hear me better now? There hasn't been a lot of active moves towards expansionism for NATO going further east, really up in over the last decade or so. There is also no ongoing genocide of ethnic Russians, which is one of the sort of false accusations that Putin has laid out as a potential justification. I think if we look at this through the motivations that Putin might have, it's about domestic dissent being at an all-time high. Opposition to Putin is at an all-time high in Russia. Just in 2020 and 2021 alone, there were over, in the first month from the end of December until January, there were 168 protests that were met with intervention or violent force in Russia in early 2021. That wave was in part caused by the arrest and detention of opposition leader Alex Navalny. And there have been continued protests about that and about ongoing corruption and lack of economic performance in the Russian Federation. On top of the internal motivation, there's also the external motivation of the spread of democracy in the region. A popularly elected charismatic leader in Ukraine certainly challenges Russia's and Putin's stance, particular that he alone is qualified to lead the Russian Federation. And in the face of ongoing domestic protest and dissent, the spread of democracy is a challenge, and you don't want that if you're an autocrat, right next door. In terms of opportunity, I think it's important to revisit some of that historical context. Russia invades Crimea in 2014 to a tepid response from the international community. There are some sanctions, but they are not nearly at the level of sanctions we've seen from the past week. The Trump administration spent 4 years actively undermining international cooperation, undermining NATO, undermining the European Union, which worked in Putin's favor. And then if you look, there's new leadership in Germany. Powerhouse Angela Merkel retires, and a new leader comes in from an previously opposition party. And you have a TV personality running Ukraine, right? Which is the extent of the current president of Ukraine's sort of professional experience. Very charismatic, very popular, but not the most politically savvy individual, or at least that was sort of Putin's expectation before launching this invasion. And so you see this sort of international weakness, the international system looking as frail as it has probably since the fall of the Soviet Union at the very least. And you see domestic dissent. You need to look strong. You need a win. this seems like an opportunity where you could get another win, just like you did with Crimea. And I think based on the events of the past week, it's not playing out the way that he expected. But I think that is a sort of pretty clear interpretation of what his expectations were. So that's really what I wanted to address, was talking about those motivations. And I hope that's helpful, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Bagwell. So at this point in the webinar, we're going to open the floor to questions. I would encourage all of our participants to use the Q&A feature. If you have a question for any of the panelists, feel free to ask your questions there. I'll start off with a broad general question for our panelists. So as a non-NATO state, what implications does the invasion have on neighboring Moldova? And additionally, could Russia use its foothold in Transnistria to launch a similar operation to the one it's currently conducting in Ukraine?
Well, I'll start on that. In Transnistria, there's like 1,400 Russian peacekeepers. So I don't think that's a very likely place to make a springboard. However, it's quite likely that the Russian forces that are moving east from Odessa will link up to Transnistria and will cut off the Ukraine from the sea, from Black Sea altogether. Then that would be the point where pressure we put on Moldova, if he's interested in Moldova. I don't, that's a bit of a stretch, but it certainly was. Bessarabia has gone back and forth between Romania and Russia and the Soviet Union over time. But I do think Transnistria is in his sights, and holding on to it, I believe, would be probably going to happen. Yeah.
Well, I would just simply add to that, there's a debate going on right now, whether Putin is unhinged, and that's why he recklessly went into Ukraine, or is he this methodical, careful, cautious person who is simply doing the very thing now that he's always done. I would put myself in the latter category. Transnistria, that goes back to 1990, right? I mean,
Right.
There's a long history here of Russia meddling in the politics of its near abroad, or the former Soviet space. There's a very long history here. Now it's obviously reached a very violent crescendo, but there is a definite history, in Moldova, Georgia, now Ukraine, and of course he's meddles in the politics, interferes with the elections, with the cyberspace of the stands, as they're referred to, as well as his European rivals. So there's a long, long history here. Putin is, I would argue, not behaving out of character, but he's behaving very consistent with what he's been doing now for many, many years.
I would echo that as well. I don't know how expansionist Putin's aims ultimately are. I think Ukraine appears to be a good target for him, one, because he sort of tested the waters with Crimea back in 2014 and was able to accomplish what appeared to be his aims then without much international objection. And then I think also sort of the pro-democracy movement helps explain some of this, right? You notice Putin hasn't invaded Belarus, right? There's still a pro-Moscow regime in Belarus. So I think the more you see sort of opposition to Moscow come from a place of popular protest and democracy, I think those are places that I would be concerned about if I was not a NATO member and I was worried about an invasion. That would certainly make me more concerned.
Thank you, guys. We have a question here from the Q&A. It is John Wagner. Professor Fernland mentioned that Japan, Italy, and Germany all had to surrender their conquered lands following World War II and cited the Kellogg Treaty. But isn't it the case that they only had to surrender them because they lost the war? If they had won, wouldn't they have kept their conquered lands?
No doubt they would have kept them. But the point is, they lost. And here's the real point. The victors, the United States, France, Great Britain, did not acquire new territory. The international community, and in particular the West, had renounced wars of conquest. They became regarded as illegitimate. Before 1928, might makes right. One state could attack and beat another state, and to the victor, go the spoils. After 1928, we live in a different world. Now, not everybody agrees with that, to be sure, but we have this benchmark. We have the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and then the Atlantic Charter, and the founding charter of the United Nations, all of which renounce aggressive wars. So that's the legal standard. And so when Putin invaded Ukraine, the president of the United States could come out and say, and rightly say, this is a flagrant violation of international law. What Putin did is illegal. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact creates that new world in international relations. Didn't exist before 1928. Happily, it exists in our own time, and it's the reference point for how we will sort this all out.
If I can jump in there and just sort of summarize some of that in like a sentence or two. Previously, to the victor went the spoils. Post-World War II, it's not to the victor goes the spoils so much as to the victors, you get to craft the international law and set up the international system how you want it to look. And so I think to sort of build on that a little bit, the Allied powers in World War II could have very easily said, okay, now we want all those colonies and taken them over. Instead, they set up this rule where this was not going to be a war of aggression world anymore, a territorial conquest war anymore. And I think that's important.
Absolutely. I think I'd like to speak a little bit on the international response with these sanctions that have been in place over the past few days. The S&P cut Russia's credit rating to junk. The ruble's lost considerable value. The Russian economy is reeling right now. How effectual do you think these sanctions will be in actualizing change? And do you think they will ultimately be effective?
I think sanctions take time. So it's not as an immediate method of causing policy change as winning a military conflict would be. But I do think they will be effective. They've effectively isolated Russia's entire financial sector. The only way these sanctions will not be effective is if they can't maintain the international cooperation to keep them going, right? If there are third-party sanctions busters, if China bails Russia out, if other countries bail Russia out, then the sanctions will be less effective. But we haven't seen a lot of countries come out and say that they're going to be willing to openly do that so far.
Well, I would add, after World War II, the Soviet Union remained in Eastern Europe. We decided we were not going to try to force them out through military means. Instead, we adopted a policy of containment. So we would try to contain the Soviet Union. What I think what we're seeing now with a rejuvenated West, a rejuvenated NATO, and which is showing unbelievable political resolve right now, is that we're going to see a policy of isolation toward Russia. We're not going to see military involvement, but we're going to see the international community, or at least the Western-led community, try to isolate him economically. Now, the big question, of course, is, China and Russia have agreed to this new alliance, if you will. Will Russia be compensated in some way for these economic losses through its economic relationship with China? I think that's going to be the big question. I would add to that it'll be the West. I predict, thinking about the future of war, what I think the West will do: A, it'll isolate Russia, and B, it will start to very actively try to force China and Russia apart. That'll be a geostrategic goal, is to try to split those two powers up in order to divide the world island, as geopoliticians like to call it, rather than go along with what we now have is with this new alliance, which combines a good part of the world island under two large autocracies.
I made just one comment about sanctions, that they have a carrot aspect, a carrot and a stick aspect, because it can be held out if talks continue that started today between Ukraine and Russia. Sanctions are a means to get Russia to more quickly agree to a more palatable solution to this. It won't be maybe palatable to the West completely, but will stop the shooting, killing, and fighting. Russia gains what they apparently what they want is a more compliant regime in Kiev, but they also want guarantees: no NATO, no EU. That might be worth doing. It's a loss of sovereignty, but it's also a gain in independence and life. So put sanctions on that are serious, but then say as soon as you conclude a armistice or a stop shooting or a truce, we could release sanctions. That might be useful.
Thank you, guys. We have a question here from Andrew, and he's asking about the comments that Putin made over the weekend regarding the future potential membership of Sweden and Finland in NATO, and that they may be possible targets for Russian aggression should they seek full membership in NATO. The question asked, is this hyperbolic rhetoric, or is this actually something that might be possible?
Well, I think it backfired. Both Finland and Sweden took great umbrage to that and said, we're sovereign nations, we'll do what we please. So we're seeing that I don't think Putin really anticipated that the West would react so forcefully to this. I think he really has underestimated that. And of course, now he's played his hand, like Ukraine this morning has applied for membership in the European Union, the very thing that he was so upset about. But of course, from Ukraine's position, well, what are you going to do? Invade me? I mean, you've done it. You have done it. So the Ukraine and the West are basically, like NATO has been rejuvenated. Germany for 30 years refused to pay up to 2% of GDP as a contribution to NATO. Now it's announced it will exceed that. I mean, that is a huge change. I mean, president after president after president, US president has tried to get Germany to pay at least 2%. Now Germany's going to pay 2%. Yes, we'll have to see if they do that. But my guess is world politics has changed, and we will see a much more active, vital Germany in the Western Alliance.
I would echo that. I think this has backfired in a way that Putin did not anticipate whatsoever. I do not think he saw Finland and Sweden immediately opening up and saying, you know what, now we're going to consider joining NATO, or the Swiss government saying, you know what, we're going to join in on these economic sanctions and freeze your assets. I think he has unified the West in a way that he did not anticipate coming whatsoever.
Absolutely. And, to kind of further follow up on these miscalculations that you were speaking about, one of our questions here in the Q&A ask about the miscalculations on the part of Putin in regard to the international community's response, as well as the domestic Ukrainian response. And the question asked if you guys can maybe speak on that a little bit.
Sorry, I didn't get all of that, Alex.
Yeah, basically just the question asked if you could speak a little bit on Putin's miscalculations to the international response and the domestic response in Ukraine.
Well, I would just say I think he underestimated. I think Dr. Bagwell, you said Zelensky was a television personality, a comedian. I think Putin. Well, we know he regards him with contempt, but I think the whole world has been blown away by Zelensky and how forceful he's been able to handle this situation. You know, I saw him in a flak jacket, I think this morning, going up and down a trench. The United States called him and said, hey, you know, maybe you need to get out of the country so we can have, you know, a government in exile. And he said, hey, what I need is ammunition, not a ride. So that line will go down in the books. So let me just say that one is for the books. Send me ammunition. I don't need a ride. That one's for the books. So I think the world has been. I think that's been unbelievably energizing to the world to see him. You know, Lord help us all, you know, if he gets killed in a couple of days or something like that. But boy, right now, he has been able, the force of his personality has been able to transform politics. And he's been able to get people in Europe, and I think in the United States, to really support Ukraine in a way that was just unimaginable even a week ago.
I agree with what Dr. Fernland says. And in this issue of miscalculation, I'm not some military hardware expert, but had this Russian invasion gone, as I assume, a blitz type thing that would have overrun the important cities of Ukraine within 2 or 3 days, it probably would have been a done deal. It would have been too late, a fait accompli. Why he halted outside of Kiev in the north, we saw what Putin's capable of in urban destruction in Chechnya and Grozny, you know, pounded it to nothingness. Was this because he has some residual feelings for Ukrainian people? That the Russian, I hear reports, but who knows how to take this seriously? The Russian army is underperforming. The Russian armor is not working as it's supposed to. Some of the modern weaponry is destroying some Russian armor. I've seen, I can't trust any of the footage I've seen. There's footage out there of destroyed heavy tanks and all this. But was his original calculation a very quick conquest? And I think it would be game over. But once it started to drag out, time is not on his side anymore. I think that's pretty clear.
I would echo those thoughts. I think if you look at sort of the route that the Russian forces took, they thought this was going to be over quickly, but they also probably anticipated there would be a prolonged insurgency of the rebel groups within Ukraine, which is one of the reasons they moved to take the Chernobyl site so quickly. It wasn't them wanting more access to nuclear materials. They have over 4,000 warheads. They have no need of it. But what they wanted to do was make sure that any potential insurgent group would not be able to get access to nuclear materials that they could use in insurgent attacks on a Russian-occupied Ukraine. And I think that's sort of evidence that Putin planned to be there, win quickly, and stay a while. And the first part of that plan is not working out. We'll see how long the stay a while part of the plan goes for him as well.
And I would just add, you know, Putin's background is as a KGB officer. So, you know, his whole career is he likes to operate in the dark. He likes clandestine operations. He likes to poison his enemies abroad, you know, using some weird radioactive chemicals and so forth. This is not that. This is a full-scale invasion using conventional weapons, conventional forces. He's never done this before. He has never done this before. In fact, a large European country invading another large European country hasn't taken place since World War II, you know? So I am not at all surprised that this went sideways, that he encountered all kinds of problems that he didn't anticipate. Remember, Ukraine is the size of Texas. And from everything I can gather, Ukrainians are kind of like Texans too. They all have weapons and they have an attitude. So, and there are 40 million of them. So, you've got 200,000 troops, a country the size of Texas, and 40 million people who are armed and want to kill you. This is not going to go well for Putin. It just, that's a hard thing to do, what he's trying to do.
Alex, if I can jump in, there have been a couple questions about language, ethnicity, in particular, and if Ukrainians are actually a separate people from Russia. And I want to respond to that by reading a little bit of the speech that the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations gave fairly recently, right on the eve of this conflict. This situation echoes our history. Kenya and almost every African country was birthed by the ending of an empire. Our borders were not of our own drawing. They were drawn by distant colonial metropoles of London, Paris, and Lisbon with no regard for the ancient nations that they cleaved apart. And then it goes on for a bit and then says, we believe that all states formed from empires that have collapsed or retreated have many peoples in them yearning for integration with peoples in neighboring states. This is normal and understandable. After all, who does not want to be joined to their brethren and to make common purpose with them? However, Kenya rejects such a yearning from being pursued by force. We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. We rejected irredentism and expansionism on any basis, including racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural factors. We reject it again today. Kenya registers its strong concern and opposition to the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. We further strongly condemn the trend in the last few decades of powerful states, including members of the Security Council, breaching international law with little regard. I think even if you believe that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people and their languages are not even cousins, but brothers to each other, this is a strong argument from the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations that this is not the way to go about reuniting peoples. I think it's persuasive and powerful.
Yeah, I would just add, I saw that speech. I saw him give that speech, and it was very, very powerful, very compelling. Yeah, I mean, basically, when Kenya joined the United Nations, Kenya and other African states, by doing that, agreed to the borders that had been drawn by the evacuating colonial powers. They were not going to try to readjust those borders by force, by wars of conquest. So they accepted that Kellogg-Briand world where, hey, you can adjust borders through diplomacy, but not by means of force. And so that was an eloquent, compelling statement that he made to uphold international law and the world order.
Yeah, I might just put a little note in here that this whole issue of language, dialect, in a sense, it's culture. We share language with Canada and Great Britain. We don't see ourselves as being somehow part of Britain. We have a culture and a tradition and a history that shaped us. Ukrainians, again, as mentioned, did not have an independent statehood, but they had an independent historical experience that many of them shared, not all, one to the other. It's well known that many Ukrainian leaders can't speak Ukrainian, yet they speak Russian, but they still feel Ukrainian. Many Irish nationalists couldn't speak Gaelic, but they spoke English, but they were dedicated to and died for, free and independent Ireland. So this goes into Perry Anderson, Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson world, that, what is a nation? What is a community? And it's a cultural thing, and it's a thing that has more to do with decisions made and commitments made by individuals. So how close or how far the language isn't necessarily determinant. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I would just also add that the ethnicity factor creates a real problem for Putin. I mean, he has said that Ukraine does not exist as a nation. The Ukrainians are just fellow Russians, fellow Slavs. So then, how do you justify, massive violence against these people if you're saying that we're one and the same? So how do you justify a war of invasion against the people who oppose your invasion? I mean, I think that it just doesn't make sense. He doesn't have a compelling story for why he is there.
Well, his story, I guess, works on certain sectors of Russia. These are neo-Nazis, they're fascists. He says the majority of Ukrainian people are yearning for reunification with the Russian people. It's just those people like, Zelensky, which of course for us doesn't play, but that's the play he's trying to make.
I think you will see also a trickle-down effect into the morale of the troops, to sort of tie this into another question that we've been asked. Is the shared history of Russia and Ukraine, or the Soviet Union and Ukraine, going to play a role in the morale of the two combatants? Will the Russian soldiers hesitate to kill? I think one thing we've seen is, with the level of dissent in Russia, it's going to be really difficult for Putin to justify staying in Ukraine and keeping an armed presence there. And the longer this drags out, the less effective Russian forces are going to be, the more difficult it is going to be for Putin to continue to get them to perform. I don't know if you'll see sort of mass desertions, or I would never predict anything like that. But, there's plenty of evidence that even high-level officials in Putin's regime are not on board with this line of action. And to think that that wouldn't trickle down to the morale of the troops and affect performance on the Russian side in particular would be, I think, foolish.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump into the Q&A here. So there's been a few questions that I've seen addressing the nuclear element, the panel's reaction to Putin's threat of possibly using nuclear weapons. Does the panel have any thoughts on that?
Well, one point that should be made with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, which had nuclear weapons, agreed to give up those nuclear weapons, which it did. And in exchange for that, the Budapest Memorandum that was issued, Russia agreed to recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity. So, I mean, I think this guy gives a little different twist on the nuclear question, but Ukraine gave up something for a promise that now Russia has clearly violated. And I think that's a very important background piece to what we're seeing play out right here.
Right. It's unfortunate that Ukraine's unilateral disarmament is showing other states that you can't afford to disarm nuke. You have to keep it to protect yourself. And that's an unfortunate lesson, but that's a real life lesson from this. It really is. Secondly, I didn't see I only saw a piece of the statement of Putin about this heightened nuclear thing, but I believe he's casting this as a defensive measure because of aggression. He's not threatening, if you don't stop your sanctions, I'm going to bomb you. It's more, I have to do this as a defensive measure against the aggression of the neo-fascists and neo-Nazis sort of thing. And again, does that play in the West? Not particularly.
I guess I would just add, I think the baseline probability of ever seeing nuclear weapons used is really low. Twice in 100 years, give or take. And so I would never predict that they're going to be used. I would never predict that this would escalate to World War III. But there is a lot of uncertainty there, and it's reasonable to be uncertain about those sorts of things. A week and a half ago, I never would have predicted that Russia would have launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I think most people were right there with me. I think it's always difficult to predict these things that happen that are outside of normal behavior and outside of the bounds of normal behavior. But I think that they are so far outside the bounds, make it a little bit more comforting in my mind, because they don't happen regularly, and that kind of escalation would be really pretty unprecedented.
All right, yeah, so as we wrap up here this afternoon, perhaps we could get some final thoughts from our panelists.
Well, I mean, it's not over yet. How this should be understood is going to be determined by the outcome of the end game of the fighting. I think it's unlikely it'll be a Ukraine that is completely independent and autonomous, but rather some sort of compromise where I think Russians may leave troops all along the Black Sea littoral and make Ukraine a landlocked country and engage in a long-term strangulation of the state. I just, well, Putin would not be able to survive if he simply withdraws everything and status quo antebellum. I just don't see that as an outcome. But the West will probably kind of allow for some sort of compromise. I hope I'm wrong, but let's see what the other panelists say. Yeah.
Just my closing thought is I think Putin has made a disastrous decision. He has damaged the Russian economy. He's damaged the reputation of Russia. I think Europe will begin the transition away from buying gas, oil from Russia. You just don't want to be put in this situation again. That's the major source of revenue. So he has just shot his economy in the head. And, I would not be surprised if we saw more unrest in Russia. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see the end of the Putin regime as a result of this. I think he really made a serious miscalculation with this invasion.
I would echo both of those comments. I see Putin as being very unlikely to willingly draw down without gaining major concessions. I think the other side of that is important, though, also. It takes two to reach a bargain, and Zelensky has been masterful in this conflict so far, the president of Ukraine. And any agreement that gets negotiated is going to have both his approval and the approval of his backers and the coalition that keeps him in power. And if you're Zelensky, it's going to be very difficult not to double down if there's some agreement where you're seeing big support from the Western powers. How far is that support going to go? And how much are you willing to gamble that you're going to be able to continue to get that support? I think it's a really important consideration. And I'll stop there, but it just with a reminder that bargaining takes several people to come to an agreement.
Right, well, we've reached the end of our time, and I would like to first thank Alex for his wonderful moderation and acknowledge that we have lots of questions that we did not have a chance to answer in the time that we had. So please, I think all of our panelists, we're grateful you're here today, and I'm sure you would be very happy to hear from any of the participants directly with a follow-up to questions posed that we didn't have time to address. So thanks once again to all of our panelists and to all of you participants, and stay tuned. Let's hope that we don't have to have too many more of these as we address such significant world events. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Everybody, great.